largely the problems that we set out to solve are still unsolved problems. We're still trying to bring greater liquidity. We're still trying to open up access. One of the issues that we ran into is that Web3 is a pretty small world, and most of the organizations that we want to work with are not in the Web3 space. They're not onboarded to blockchain. So a big part of what we've been working on over the last few years is integrating innovations like account abstraction to make it easier for people to access this market who may not have anything to do with Web3 or blockchain, but they want to access the carbon markets.
Welcome to the Regeneration Will Be Funded. This is a show about regenerative finance, exploring pathways to a life-affirming economy. I'm your host, Matthew Monahan, and today we're with Marcus Levine. He is a contributor at KlimaDAO. Marcus, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Matthew. Great to be with you.
So what is KlimaDAO?
KlimaDAO is a decentralized finance protocol that is using blockchain technology and other digital technologies to solve long-standing problems in the voluntary carbon market and other ecological benefit asset markets.
Many who come from the Web3 space will likely be familiar with this name, KlimaDAO. You were quite early around refi and kind of catalyzed a lot of momentum in the field. And of course, there's going to be a lot of people who aren't familiar. Would love to start with kind of the history of KlimaDAO and help us understand really the context and the background.
Sure. So KlimaDAO was formed by three different organizations that had been operating in the carbon markets for several years, starting around 2015 to 2017. And these three organizations were attacking different problems in the carbon markets. On one hand, you had a group called Offsetra that was doing emissions analysis for public blockchains like Ethereum and helping projects that were operating on Ethereum to become carbon neutral by consuming carbon credits in the voluntary market. There's also Toucan Protocol, which started as a hackathon project and eventually developed into a tokenization protocol for bringing carbon credits from the traditional off-chain systems where they're issued onto a public blockchain. There's also a group called Creel, and they were doing some work in the energy efficiency and building management space and using carbon credits as part of their strategy. And these three orgs noticed that there were a certain set of problems in the carbon markets that were holding back their organizations from achieving their goals. In particular, there was a lack of access, so it was hard for these organizations to access the carbon market. There's also a lack of liquidity. It was difficult to find credits when they were looking to buy, and also a lack of programmability, the ability to retire or consume those carbon credits on a programmatic basis, where rather than once a year or once a quarter going into an interface and clicking a button, these organizations wanted to automate the retirement of those credits so that they could be baked into business processes. So for instance, every time an NFT was minted, a small amount of carbon credits could be retired. And this wasn't really possible in the traditional carbon market infrastructure. And so these three organizations came together to build something that neither of them could build alone. And that something was KlimaDAO.
And my understanding is it was also built atop a lot of the patterns or primitives of Olympus DAO. Can you share more there?
Yeah, that's right. As the initial protocol mechanism, the KlimaDAO founders adopted the Olympus DAO mechanism, where the protocol acquires assets through a mechanism called bonding and uses those assets to provide liquidity and build a treasury behind a token, in this case called Klima. And the vision there was that by building this treasury and creating protocol-owned liquidity, it becomes possible for individuals and smaller businesses to buy, sell, and retire carbon in a way that the traditional market doesn't facilitate. And this is really unlocked by primitives like decentralized exchanges, which in the Web3 space we're all familiar with, but the basic concept is that instead of having a counterparty where you place a buy order and someone else needs to place a corresponding sell order, a liquidity pool is created where equal amounts of two different assets are put into the pool, and then a user can buy and sell instantaneously out of that pool.
And can you share more about this concept of protocol-owned liquidity?
Sure. So in the initial wave of DEX deployments, most of the liquidity is provided by third parties. And those third parties need an incentive, need some reason to provide liquidity. You can think about this as renting liquidity. And typically protocols would pay out their own token to these liquidity providers in exchange for them continuing to provide liquidity. But this system doesn't really last a long time. And as the incentives wind down,
Right.
usually the liquidity disappears.
Right.
The idea behind protocol-owned liquidity is that the protocol itself, the DAO itself, holds these assets in a treasury and manages them through a decentralized governance process so that that liquidity stays in place for a longer period of time and is available for users to buy and sell, regardless of whether the incentives to rent that liquidity are still in place.
Yeah, so this, I guess, simultaneously addresses the issue that some people critique or observe, that a lot of LPs lose money, liquidity providers lose money when putting capital into the pools. And Uniswap, for example, a decentralized exchange. But then it also kind of, I guess, creates a bit of a competitive strategy or a financial strategy for protocols themselves in terms of their viability and long-term growth.
Exactly. And because KlimaDAO's mission is to support the scaling up of the carbon markets and other environmental assets, there's a clear motivation for the protocol to continue providing that liquidity, whereas a individual liquidity provider is simply trying to maximize their return on investment.
So you said those three problems. Access was the first, liquidity was the second, and the third, how did you frame it? Programmability. And so is this kind of the promise of blockchains and carbon credits kind of converging together? Is this digitization with the shared ledger kind of unlocks this potential?
So there's a variety of areas in the carbon market where blockchain technology can play a role. And I think it might be useful to step back and speak a little bit about the structure of the carbon market and how it functions.
Right.
So the basic premise of the carbon market is that on one side, you have people who have money and want to fund verified impact. On the other side, you have project developers who are going to go out in the world and take that positive impact and then get their impact verified. And there's different set of problems on both sides of the market. On the supply side, the major problems are around the verification and registration of the projects, tracking the data collected about those projects, and making sure that they're actually carrying out the activity that they claim to be carrying out. On the demand side, there's a different set of problems, mostly related to connecting buyers with the supply of credits that they want to purchase. And KlimaDAO set out to solve some of the problems on the demand side. We don't touch as many of the problems on the supply side. And those problems on the demand side are, as I described, around access, liquidity, and programmability.
And why the access challenge today?
So up to now, the carbon markets have been dominated by large corporations who are offsetting their emissions by calculating their emissions on an annual or quarterly basis, and then going out into the market to find project developers and credits that meet their objectives. But I believe that if this market is going to scale, we're going to need to bring in a broader set of actors. Because while large corporations are some of the biggest emitters, most organizations are small and medium businesses. And there's also individuals who want to do their part and contribute to verified climate action. So the current market infrastructure that is oriented around a network of brokers who call each other on the phone, send emails back and forth, that market infrastructure will not scale to meet the scope of the climate crisis.
Right. Okay, so KlimaDAO also went through some drama and controversy and kind of major highs and lows. And would love to hear, you've been one of the more public-facing, persistent contributors, although you weren't there necessarily at the very initial founding. So I think it speaks to your belief in the project and your persistence years later now. So part of this conversation wanted to, just kind of understand more of like how it all happened and then of course where we're at and where we're headed.
Yeah, so I first heard about KlimaDAO on the Bankless podcast in September of 2021. And I got really excited about the opportunity to leverage my data-driven skill set to solve problems in the carbon markets. So I jumped in with 2 feet. I started contributing as a moderator, answering people's questions once I had figured out some of what was going on. But honestly, it was a very chaotic time. There was a lot of stuff going on and a lot of new concepts to learn about. And looking back on the launch, there were definitely some opportunities that were missed. In particular, we started with one big basket of carbon credits, known as BCT, or the base carbon ton. And the idea was that people who had carbon credits in the off-chain world could bring those credits on-chain and deposit them into the Klima treasury in exchange for the Klima token. And the structure was set up so that the one pool that you could deposit into was called BCT. And looking back, there was definitely an opportunity to create multiple pools, because the reality is that the carbon markets are quite stratified. There are many different types of methodologies or the specific process that a project developer will carry out to implement the positive action. As an example, some methodologies include planting trees or afforestation, renewable energy installation, or even something like direct air capture, where you build a factory that has a chemical process that separates carbon dioxide from the air and sequesters it in some long-term storage. And these different methodologies have different costs associated with implementing them,
Right.
and therefore they fetch different prices on the market. And the initial approach that KlimaDAO took, adopted from the Olympus DAO mechanism, made a somewhat idealistic assumption that all carbon credits could be priced with a single basket.
Got it.
And looking back, having multiple asset classes, multiple pools, would have helped to stratify this market better and better price the individual projects relative to each other.
Got it. So I guess that addresses the kind of one of the learnings. What about kind of this huge rush of energy? I mean, it was also coinciding with crypto markets going crazy and then kind of crashing, and like the internal machinations of what happened within the community during that time.
Yeah, part of the promise of what KlimaDAO set out to do is to leverage the energy and excitement and the novel financial infrastructure provided by the blockchain community to push a big boulder off a hill.
Right.
Because the carbon markets have been largely unchanged in structure over the last 30 years. There's been a few innovations, moving from faxes to email, moving to digital systems that record PDFs rather than having to send those PDFs around just by email. But ultimately, the same tech stack has been in use since the early 2000s.
Right.
And there's a set of market actors within the carbon market that are comfortable with the way things are. That's how they're familiar with doing business. And so in 2021, when KlimaDAO launched, we created quite a splash by moving about 5% of the total supply of carbon credits existing in the market onto a public blockchain.
So 5% of the entire market, which had been developing for decades at that point, right? All in a launch.
Within a few months, yeah.
Within a few months. It's quite an impact.
Indeed. And so the rest of the carbon market sat up and noticed. And there were a variety of conversations started about the role of blockchain technology that it could play in the market. Several consultations were spun up to better understand this technology and how it could be applied. And ultimately, I think that we did push the market forward to consider the use of this technology. And now if you go to a carbon market conference, we're here at Climate Week in New York, you hear a lot about the use of blockchain technology to improve the transparency, the access, the liquidity situation of the carbon markets. And so I think it's now pretty clear that this technology is going to play a role, but there's still some question about how it will play that role and which of the financial primitives that exist in the blockchain space will be applied to carbon markets.
Got it. But it also got shut off, right? Like Vera kind of said, no, we don't like what this is about, and kind of closed the door on the bridge of how you were moving these credits on chain.
Yeah, so Vera is one of the largest carbon credit issuers in the world, and therefore the one that we focused on when we initially launched. And there was some concern among the Vera staff that this mechanism for tokenizing their assets created some confusion or led to uncertainty about the nature of the assets that had been tokenized. Now, we made every effort to explain how the tokenization process worked. We were working closely with Toucan Protocol, who built the bridge for bringing those assets on chain, and clearly laid out the fact that the underlying assets are the same once they've been tokenized. In fact, this mechanism we used has a precedent in the carbon markets. As I said, they've been around for about 30 years, and the original implementation of carbon markets was called the Clean Development Mechanism, launched under the Kyoto Protocol back in the 90s. And the idea behind the Clean Development Mechanism, or CDM, was to fund projects in the developing world with capital from developed countries that would otherwise not be possible to finance. Largely installation of renewable energy, decomposition of landfill gas, and other industrial process change that are very capital intensive, but have a very high potential to reduce emissions. And so the CDM, the first generation of carbon markets, was launched in the 90s, but eventually some issues were identified with the CDM. And that led to the second generation of carbon markets, of which Vera was one of the leading organizations. And so Vera actually transferred a large number of credits from the CDM registry to the Vera registry and used a very similar process for doing that transfer, as Toucan later utilized to transfer credits from the Vera registry onto a public blockchain. And so we tried to make that case, and Vera was still concerned, so they put in place a change to their terms of service in May of 2022. And they also launched a consultation alongside that change to understand the role of blockchain technology and how it could be effectively and safely implemented to deliver on the promise that it held.
Mm. And then Vera went through its own different sets of controversial headlines and some leadership changes. And where are we at now with kind of the traditional carbon credits industry players and the blockchain players? Is everyone singing kumbaya, saying we're marching from the same script? Is it contentious, and everyone's still trying to kind of carve out their own silos or visions, or kind of help us understand from the outside how to make sense of this?
Yeah, so there's a lot more collaboration going on now than there was a few years ago. We're working with several of the newer registries, like Eco Registry, Puro Earth, and International Carbon Registry, who are much more forward-thinking about the use of technology in the carbon markets. In particular, ICR is a really interesting case where they issue their credits directly onto the Polygon blockchain. And that makes integrating with our infrastructure really straightforward because the credits themselves are already ERC 1155 tokens. So there's no tokenization process needed per se. Whereas other registries like Eco Registry, they use a private blockchain for their own infrastructure. And because it's a blockchain already, there's a greater level of interoperability than the traditional Web 2 based systems that an organization like Vera still relies on. So I'd say there's been a lot of collaboration, and we're looking forward to continuing to work with the traditional players because ultimately the incumbent players have an important role to play. They have expertise and they know how this market operates. So bringing them along for the ride is a really important part of the next steps for KlimaDAO.
Yeah. Okay, so you had this huge, explosion of interest in capital that coincided with what was happening in crypto at the time, and then crypto crashed, and all of the carbon space crashed, and you had the microdynamics of Vera pulling the cord, and all these things. Like, what happened in that fallout? And I just find your story fascinating because you're still here and you're still building and you're still working on this, and that's usually a really interesting sign that there's something there, but also just requires a special type of person to kind of persist through those challenges. Like kind of maybe add a little more color to that context as well.
Yeah, so largely the problems that we set out to solve are still unsolved problems. We're still trying to bring greater liquidity. We're still trying to open up access. One of the issues that we ran into is that Web3 is a pretty small world, and most of the organizations that we want to work with are not in the Web3 space. They're not onboarded to blockchain. So a big part of what we've been working on over the last few years is integrating innovations like account abstraction to make it easier for people to access this market who may not have anything to do with Web3 or blockchain, but they want to access the carbon markets.
What is account abstraction?
Account abstraction provides a way to create wallets, accounts for people on a public blockchain without requiring them to store and manage their own private key. So there are various services now for providing account abstraction. We're working with a Circle service that allows you to create wallets on your user's behalf and use multi-party computing to split up the secret so that no one party has full access to the account, but the user, the holder of the account, can recover it if they were ever to lose access.
Got it. So roughly how many people are working on the KlimaDAO project now?
So we have about a dozen contributors now. We went through a pretty spectacular growth phase where we ended up onboarding almost 100 contributors in the wake of launch.
Wow.
Not everything that those contributors were doing was super valuable, but it was an exciting time and a lot of people wanted to get involved.
Yeah.
So over the course of the last few years, we've been honing in on the real value adding activities and focusing on building high quality software.
Got it. And KlimaDAO, the DAO part, tell me more about that. Like, is it really a DAO? What does that mean? What's it like to work with a DAO?
Yeah, so DAO stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organization. And there's really two key elements there, right? A decentralization and autonomy. And most DAOs don't start out fully decentralized, nor do they start out fully autonomous. There's a growth process that needs to happen where you go from a small group of committed contributors who have a vision to a large community of tens of thousands of people all over the world carrying that vision forward. So KlimaDAO very quickly went from a small organization with a dozen founders to a community of tens of thousands of people with over 100 contributors over the course of a few weeks. And that was a unsustainable level of growth. So being a DAO ultimately has meant a journey of progressive decentralization where we've identified areas for passing over power to the community and areas where more centralization is needed to ensure professional and competent execution. As a particular example, we started doing direct project financing about 3 years ago, and shortly after the launch. And what that means is we're putting capital directly into carbon projects that need that money to go out and implement their project. And in exchange, the KlimaDAO treasury receives carbon credits once they're issued, basically an IOU on future carbon credits.
Mm.
And this mechanism uses our public governance to decide whether or not to finance a particular project. So while the initial process of scoping out project developers and bringing them to the table is done by a small group of contributors, the final decision about whether or not to put money into that particular project is left to the community of tens of thousands of token holders.
Mm-hmm.
So as an example, we funded a project in Bangladesh that is distributing cook stoves to refugees in a refugee camp from Myanmar. And those refugees are currently cooking on traditional open fires, which is not very efficient and also leads to women and girls spending a lot of time cooking and gathering firewood.
Mm-hmm.
So by giving enhanced cook stoves that are more efficient and cook faster to these communities, it both reduces emissions and has positive benefits for the community.
Mm.
So there was a proposal put up with one of our partners, StarCB, they're a traditional carbon market operator, to put 250,000 USDC into this project. That went up on our governance forum. There was discussion about the details of the project from our community. All of this happened in public. And then finally, it went to a vote on Snapshot, and the Klima token holders voted to fund this project. So that's an example of how we're mixing both a centralized element where, StarCB is a traditional developer. We, some of the contributors spoke with them about the idea. They posted that on a public governance forum, and then a community discussion occurred, and a community vote ultimately decided whether or not to fund. Now, there are definitely some complications to operating as a DAO. As a contributor, one of the things that's always a little uncertain is like who makes decisions? How do we know what to work on? How to prioritize that work? And so that was definitely a friction point early on and led to some internal battles about what we should be prioritizing and how we should be working on it.
Great. Well, I'd love to get into more of your visions for where the project goes from here. But first, also really curious, like your background, motivations a bit, deeper and context coming into this.
Sure. So I grew up in South Florida, and it was clear to me from a young age that people living in South Florida in a modern lifestyle with houses, not a very sustainable idea. And with sea levels rising, there was a clear threat to that way of life in South Florida. So I wanted to get involved in climate action, but it wasn't really clear to me how. I went to university in New York and took a couple of classes related to climate action. A class called The Philosophical Problems of Climate Change introduced me to some of the ideas about how to attack this problem, but it wasn't really clear to me how to get involved. And so when I graduated, I ended up getting a job as a data scientist, working in private industry, but I felt unfulfilled. I felt like there was something more that I could contribute my skills to. So in 2021, when I heard about KlimaDAO, I got excited about the opportunity to leverage my data skill set to solve real problems in an existing carbon markets. And it's been really fulfilling to learn more about that field, to see opportunities to apply my skill set in a way that the incumbent players, they see the problem, but they may not have the technical skill set to apply a solution.
And I guess that really speaks to this, what's often referred to as permissionless nature of the blockchain Web3 space, that you don't necessarily need a particular type of credential or someone to say, yes, go do this or whatever. Like there ends up being these kind of porous membranes where people can get more involved and kind of express their energy voluntarily and proactively to say, yes, I want to go contribute to that problem. What do you notice in that type of cultural field of the Web3 space?
Yeah. Well, so on one hand, we need all hands on deck to solve the climate issue. It's not a situation where policy wonks alone can address this. I'm pretty skeptical about the feasibility of government action coming in from the top down, at least until we see pretty severe consequences of the climate crisis. I think it's really important that we collaborate together and that people with different backgrounds and different skill sets work together on this really difficult problem. There's a useful framework that I like to reference for this from organizational psychology known as insiders, outsiders, and beyonders. So an insider is someone who's working within an incumbent system to drive systems change in an incremental way by using the existing levers of power. An outsider is someone, out in the street with a sign protesting, pushing putting pressure on the incumbents to change.
Mhm.
A beyonder goes off in a field somewhere, is building their own little prototype, their own experiment, trying to figure out what works on their own.
Mm.
And they're not necessarily trying to disrupt or change the way that the insiders are operating or the outsiders are going about their business. But what they build, what the beyonders come up with, may end up being super useful and solving some real problems that the insiders and outsiders are trying to address.
Mm.
And so I think the greatest opportunity for systems change is when those insiders, outsiders, and beyonders come together, share ideas, collaborate, and learn to understand each other's perspective so that we can work together and solve some of these longstanding problems.
Mm. Yeah, that's a useful way to create a taxonomy around it. Okay, so I know you're kind of cooking up KlimaDAO 2.0. So give us some alpha and help us understand what's coming and more importantly, what your vision is for where this is all headed.
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that one of the big missed opportunities around the launch was the creation of a single pool that combined all the different types of carbon credits into one asset. And a big part of the Klima 2.0 vision is to address that discrepancy in the different prices or values of different types of carbon. So what we're trying to do is move the treasury from a mechanism that treats all carbon credits as equal to a mechanism that prices those credits relative to each other and allows a community to voice preferences for which type of asset the treasury should prioritize. So in this new model, the Klima token becomes an index of many different types of carbon.
Mm.
And there's a governance token that will be introduced that will determine the balance of that portfolio.
Mm.
And the idea is that individuals who have information in the market about which carbon classes are going to be most valuable or most desirable in the future can express those preferences to the treasury and then be rewarded for providing high quality information that leads to accurate outcomes.
Mm.
In very concrete terms, the treasury starts with an existing balance sheet, but it needs to progress in the direction that the market is moving. So right now we hear a lot of talk about removals, carbon removals. And the basic idea is that there are two different types of credits fundamentally. One type of credit is known as an avoidance, where some emissions that would have gone up in the atmosphere will be avoided through the action of the project. So that cook stove project I mentioned is avoiding emissions from cooking by improving the efficiency of the cook stove. On the other hand, you have a removal, which takes carbon that's already up in the atmosphere, brings it down and stores it somewhere in a more or less durable way. So planting a tree, the tree grows up, puts carbon into its wood, and that wood is then sequestering the carbon for the life of the tree. On the other hand, you have engineered removals where you build a factory or some other industrial processing plant where it's going to take carbon out of the atmosphere and store it in some durable medium. And the treasury right now is primarily composed of avoidance credits of various types. And those avoidance credits have different values relative to each other. So let's say that the market is moving toward removals. Then the treasury should have a preference to acquire more removals and fewer avoidances.
Mm-hmm.
And a user could express that preference by voting for the treasury to accumulate more removals and less avoidance. And that would lead to the treasury pricing those removals at a higher level and therefore being willing to pay more on a per ton basis for those credits.
Mm-hmm.
Conversely, let's say another Guardian article comes out and attacks a certain removal methodology, points out some flaws, maybe some areas for improvement. And people in the market know that this methodology is going to be under question. So they may reallocate their votes to have the treasury prioritize a different type of credit.
Mm.
And over time, the idea is that the Klima index reflects the most valuable, most desirable credits that are available in the market, informed by these voters using their voting power to inform the treasury and being rewarded for making the most accurate predictions.
Got it. So how much are you, can you equate this to parallels in other commodities markets? Because obviously, like a barrel of oil, not all barrels of oil are the same, right? And there's all sorts of complexity of prices about different types of oil refinery methods and so forth. And is that kind of the easiest way to kind of think of the parallel that the carbon commodity market will develop in similar fashion, but now you're kind of bringing all these new innovations around things like governance tokens and programmability and liquidity and so forth into that space? And what other parallels can be drawn?
Yeah, the analogy with commodity markets is definitely relevant. There are different opinions about how directly that analogy should be applied, but I think it is a useful frame. So ironically, in the context of oil, we have different classes, different grades, and they're priced relative. And depending on the needs of the global economy, which types of oil are most in demand may change over time.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, with carbon credits, there are different classes that are priced relative to each other. And over time, those relative prices may change. So in particular, last year, there was an article that came out from The Guardian that called into question one of the most popular methodologies, which is avoided deforestation. The idea is that there are forests all over the world that are under threat of being cut down for logging or for clearing for agricultural land. And you can pay the people who live in those communities to protect that forest instead of allowing loggers to cut it down. And this methodology was called into question based on some academic research, and the market very quickly moved away from this methodology. Now, whether or not this methodology is actually useful and appropriate remains to be seen. There are definitely some problems to be solved with this particular methodology. But in my opinion, protecting those tropical rainforests is really important activity.
Mm-hmm.
But regardless, the market changed its perspective on that credit class. And we saw that the prices adjusted very quickly, such that renewable energy-based carbon credits, which had previously been priced lower than avoided deforestation credits, were suddenly commanding a premium over avoided deforestation. And so the idea of Klima 2.0, what we're trying to build, is a mechanism that can govern the market in a more transparent and public manner, so that rather than everyone rushing to one side of the boat when an article comes out, there's a more deliberate process of expressing preferences and adjusting the market conditions over time that hopefully provides a more stable situation for the project developers.
Mm-hmm.
Because the reality is that these projects often take years to develop and have verified. So if the market is changing its preferences on a monthly or daily basis, it makes it a very uncertain situation for the project developers to go raise capital and deploy their projects, because they need to make a commitment for 3 to 5 years when they start their project.
Right. I understand you're also active on that pillar of programmability and making an API accessible to other partners so that they can kind of retire credits instantaneously through KlimaDAO. Can you share more about that?
Sure. So in around the middle of 2022, we realized that there was a need to build a more user-friendly interface to interact with the on-chain carbon markets. Because the reality is that these credits are made to be used. They're made to be, quote, retired or consumed. And then a claim is typically made, whether that's, posting on social media about how I offset my flight, or I contributed to a afforestation project for my children. The typical use is for a large corporation, as part of their sustainability commitments, to consume these credits and then put out a big PDF report with their, once annual or once quarterly carbon credit activity.
Mm-hmm.
As we set out to mature the on-chain carbon market and bring real users to the table, we realized that there was a need for a more user-friendly interface for non-Web3 users. So we started building something that we called Carbonmark, which is an Amazon-style marketplace, a two-sided marketplace, where users who have carbon credits can list them for sale, and users who want to source carbon credits can browse a variety of projects, see all the information about them, and make a purchasing decision. That UI, while it's useful for the existing use case of, corporates doing quarterly or annual offsetting, and also for individuals and small businesses who want to do a manual retirement, we realized there was also an opportunity to build an API that behaves and looks like a Web2 API that many organizations would be familiar with from other SaaS providers, but interacts with the on-chain market to issue programmatic retirements. So as an example, we're working with a logistics company, and they want to set it up so that every time one of their trucks leaves a warehouse, they calculate the emissions associated with that trip and consume carbon credits to compensate for the emissions of that trip. And in the traditional market, this isn't really possible, because the settlement of a transaction requires calling someone on the phone, sending an email, wire transfer. Typical settlement times for those type of activities are 3 weeks to 6 weeks. Because of the on-chain infrastructure that KlimaDAO built, suddenly we could settle those transactions in just seconds. And that unlocks the possibility for true programmatic retirement, where every time a business process takes place, a small amount of carbon credits gets retired.
Yeah, you can see how these things are starting to all form together and coalesce together. So Carbonmark was spun out formally?
Yeah, so in the middle of last year, there was a governance proposal put up on the Klima Governance Forum to spin out Carbonmark. The realization being that building high quality software, especially software that has a Web2 facing interface, where we need to invoice customers, have a bank account, a lot of those logistical issues start to become a problem when you're operating as a DAO. So by spinning out Carbonmark into a private company, we solve a lot of those logistical issues and also present a more friendly, familiar face to traditional companies who are maybe turned off by the idea or put off by the idea that a DAO is going to be handling their transactions.
Right. Yeah, and I guess it kind of also rhymes with this recurring pattern of, protocols versus apps or modular blockchain kind of architectures. And yeah, really kind of leaning in on what's fit for purpose and what makes sense and kind of creating more tight parameters around that and letting it be its own structure.
Yeah, and even logistically, just running a software development team is a lot easier when you don't have this question about who's in charge, how do we prioritize, because there's only so many hours in the day, and software developers need clear direction about what they should build and why.
Mm.
I wanted to circle back on sort of the vision for Carbonmark, though, because ultimately, if we're going to succeed in addressing the climate crisis, we need to integrate the compensation of the negative externality, the negative impact that our everyday activities have, as close to those activities as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And programmatic retirement is a key way to do that, because every transaction suddenly becomes an opportunity to direct a small amount of money toward positive action.
Right. Right. So it's kind of like a tax, but it's really kind of getting much more tightly integrated and transparent about how many funds, where those funds are going, and then what the downstream retirement of credits looks like.
Indeed. And, a tax is typically implemented by a government. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm a bit skeptical that governments will act in a coordinated fashion until we see really severe consequences. But one of the things that makes me really excited about the approach that we're taking of building open technology, open source software on public blockchains, is that if and when governments are ready to allocate billions or trillions of dollars to fund projects taking verifiable action, this same infrastructure that we're building for private companies and individuals to fund those projects could just as well be utilized by governments to deploy that capital in an effective and verifiable way.
Yeah. Yeah, well said. So we've talked a lot about carbon, but I know you also are thinking beyond carbon. Tell me more.
There are different dimensions to the climate crisis. We focus a lot on carbon because it's easy to measure, and the market for carbon credits has been around for 30 years. It's also one of the leading drivers of the greenhouse gas effect, which is the primary driver of global warming. But there's a framework called the planetary boundaries, which identifies that global warming is only one of the ways in which our human civilization is pushing the planet beyond its boundaries. Other aspects like biodiversity loss, acidification of the ocean need to be addressed. Water quality, and carbon does not directly target those, but it is a useful frame to think about how you might develop a market-based solution that can alleviate the pressure on those planetary boundaries. So I was part of an activator called the Ecological Benefits Framework Activator, and we developed a framework for assessing ecological benefit along 6 different axes, 6 different dimensions, of which carbon is only one. We also looked at water, soil, air, biodiversity, and equity. And the idea is that you can develop a market for these different positive impacts so that we can fund projects that not just avoid or remove carbon emissions, but also have a positive impact on biodiversity or have a net positive impact on water quality, price those relative to each other, and then bundle together the benefits that a particular project might have. Now, I'll be honest, those other markets are still quite nascent. There's a lot of interest in things like water markets and biodiversity markets, but it's a really new phenomenon. Over the last few years, there have been some experiments and prototypes, but the idea is that we can leverage some of the problems that have been solved in the carbon markets and some of the solutions that are now being developed to address the remaining issues to skip over or bootstrap some of those problems in the other markets. And the EBF provides a clear framework for thinking about those issues.
Yeah. Interesting. Going back to the launch of KlimaDAO being kind of this moment where you were pushing the boulder up the mountain, and you said, there has been kind of this impact in retrospect of moving the market forward. How much do you think that pattern is helpful or detrimental or important in terms of how we might bootstrap or push these other types of markets forward where, we're going to crack a few eggs and, it's not all going to be picture perfect in terms of figuring out the right solution, but we need these kinds of, move fast and break things kinds of moments at times to to wake us up out of our slumber of where right now we're completely mispricing and misunderstanding the relationship between our economy and nature. And yeah, any other commentary about how you think is the right go to market or market making approach of some of these other forms of ecological interventions?
So on one hand, the use of digital technology from the get-go to monitor and verify these projects and other aspects of the climate crisis, I think is going to be really important.
Mm.
Because in the traditional carbon markets, a lot of the issues that have come up around the integrity of the projects have to do with the fact that there's a lot of manual processes involved. There's also an issue of scalability. Right now, as a carbon project developer, it can take you 6 months just to get your project registered with a registry and start implementation.
Mm.
So by compressing those timelines and using digital technology to verify those projects, I think we can open up the floodgates for the new markets much more quickly.
Mm.
It's taken the carbon markets about 30 years to get to the point we are today. And over those 30 years, only about 2 billion tons of carbon credits have been issued.
Mm.
Compared to the size of the problem, it's a drop in the bucket. For context, we emit about 40 billion tons every year, and there's about 2 trillion tons already up in the atmosphere.
So we've created 2 billion credits, and
Like-
there's 2 trillion tons in the atmosphere that we need to be taking down.
Plus the 40 billion every year we're adding. So it really is a small part of the solution right now.
Mm.
But the promise is that by adopting digital technology, by scaling up this market, we can grow it to have a more substantial impact.
Mm.
What I would hope for these new markets is that rather than taking 30 years to get to a fraction of a percent of what we need to do, that we can adopt some of the learnings from the carbon markets around digitization, around automation, programmability,
Mm-hmm.
structuring the market with different classes of credits.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can apply some of those learnings to these new markets to skip over some of the steps that have taken 30 years to get to where we are and help those markets scale up more quickly.
Mm-hmm. Well, Marcus, what a pleasure to hear you speak to these topics. You're very knowledgeable. I was initially skeptical of KlimaDAO, not because I understood it, but just because of the noise around it.
Mm.
And when I asked people, "Oh, should I interview KlimaDAO?" everyone kind of kept telling me in the space, like, Marcus is great. He understands this. He's very thoughtful. So I'm glad that that we had a chance to do this. So how do people find out more and get involved in the product, the interface, the DAO, et cetera?
Yeah, so if you want to learn more about KlimaDAO, you can check out our website, klimadao.finance, join the Discord community and start asking questions. And Carbonmark has our own website, carbonmark.com. If you're interested in buying or retiring credits or integrating with our API, feel free to check that out too.
Excellent. And for more great discussions like this one, including exploring other aspects of where Web3 and climate and regeneration intersect, just go to maearth.com. We are going to continue to publish episodes out from our time here at New York Climate Week 2024. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, follow, all of that as well. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.